One of the areas of leadership as an African continent that some observers may have criticized in terms of Pan-Africanism is around the climate change debate and narrative. And so the question for you is, does Africa have strong enough leadership on climate change as it impacts the continent? COP after COP, the commitments are made. Some would say the elusive $100 billion of funding commitment made by countries in the global north. Around 70% of funding from your institution, AfDB, climate funding goes to climate adaptation to help the continent cope with the effects of climate change. But year after year, we see it here in Nigeria, the rising sea levels, the drought, the food disruptions in the supply chain from all sorts of climate effects. How can we really, at least for the rest of your term, amplify Africa's needs and requirements on the world stage and take more ownership of the solutions for the African continent?
Well, climate change is very devastating for the world, but even more devastating for Africa. You know, we didn't cause climate change. Let's be clear about that. Africa accounts for no more than 3% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, but it suffers disproportionately from the negative consequences of it. Today, we lose $7 to $15 billion a year to climate change. And if we do nothing, that trajectory continues, that will easily reach close to $50 billion a year by maybe 2040. And so that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. So when you talk about how we make sure that Africa's voice is heard, I think Africa's voice being heard is not enough. There has to be a vuvuzela on Africa's voice, which is really loud and clear. Africa needs a lot more financial resources to tackle climate change. So, but I don't have the luxury of complaining. My job is to find solutions with my institution and with the support of my shareholders. And we are doing that and providing exactly the kind of leadership globally for Africa today on climate change. Let me give you a few examples of that. So adaptation to climate change is what we got to do because we didn't cause climate change. So we have to adapt to the negative consequences of it. Most of that will affect our farmers. That will affect our waters and our streams. It will affect us in many, many, many ways. And so at African Development Bank, as you rightly said, we put 67% right now of our resources into climate adaptation. So helping to support farmers, helping countries to deal with the consequences of climate change. So that's what we do. Now, we also, I got together with former United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who is the chair of the Global Center on Adaptation, and with the CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation, Professor Bakrijan. And we asked ourselves, what is it that we can do for Africa at scale? And so we set up what's called the African Adaptation Acceleration Program. It's AAAP. Kind of like it because my initials are on my own names, AAA. But that is to mobilize $25 billion for Africa to tackle climate adaptation. It is today the largest adaptation program in the whole world. And the rest of the world is trying to copy or borrow.
And is it yielding results already?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'll just walk you to one of the things that we also did and what the results of that would be. Take, for example, the 37 countries I mentioned to you that depend on the African Development Fund that I talked to you about. They are the most vulnerable to climate change and the ones that have the least resources to actually adapt to it. 9 out of the 10 most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change are in Africa. And they happen to be in those countries that depend on the African Development Fund of the bank. So what we did was our donors put together $429 million for that particular vehicle. And we want to grow it into anything between $4 billion and $13 billion. But forget the money. Think about what it will do. For example, it will provide climate-resilient agricultural technologies for 20 million farmers. Lack of information in how you actually know when weather patterns are going to change on you and therefore you can make your decision is one of the reasons why farmers, most rural populations cannot adapt to climate change. So it will provide climate information to over 20 million farmers and pastoralists across Africa. It will help to rejuvenate over 1 million hectares of degraded land. It will provide about 9.8 million people with access to water and sanitation, and the list goes on. And so that's the kind of thing that I really believe is important. And the other part with taking leadership is how to use markets to transfer the risk, climate risk, that countries face into the market. And so the African Development Bank pioneered what is called the African Disaster Risk Insurance Facility. So essentially what it is we just pay the premium for countries to transfer their climate risk, exogenous climate risk, straight to the market. And it works. Take, for example, like in Madagascar, it helped them to provide about $12 million, allowed them to be able to support over 2.2 million farmers when they had, you remember the cyclones that hit them, that hit several other countries. It helped in Malawi when they also had droughts. We supported them to be able to support over close to almost 2.5 million farmers with that. Now we are even going a step further, because you mentioned COP, because it's something to have COP, conference of parties, but I always ask myself, the cup should not be empty. The cup should be kind of full. And one of the things that we took there is now what we call the ACRIFA, Africa Climate Risk Insurance Facility for Africa, which is now to mobilize $1 billion to insure every single country against exogenous climate shocks. And this will be the first of such that is quite systemic, in the sense that we're trying to also build domestic reinsurance market, and also taking some of the risk from here, also the global reinsurance market. So you can see that we are playing so great leadership. But let me say something that UN Secretary General Guterres said. At the United Nations General Assembly, he said, look, he had wanted every country and every institution, to devote at least 50% to climate adaptation and 50% to climate mitigation. And he said in his speech to the world at the UN General Assembly, he singled out the African Development Bank Group. And he said the African Development Bank Group, we were about 63% in adaptation. We had far exceeded the 50%. And he said, African Development Bank is showing global leadership, and the rest of the world should follow that. That tells you the kind of leadership that we are taking on this particular issue. And I take it very, very seriously, because not only must we grow, we must be mindful of the headwinds that will come from climate change, and therefore be ready for it, ensure ourselves, adapt, but make sure that our voice is heard. Yeah. And you mentioned the $100 billion. We, the African Development Bank, together with the World Bank, with other multilateral financial institutions, are doing our part to make sure that we, actually by last year, we were very close to that $100 billion, almost $92 billion that we were able to raise collectively in dealing with it. But I know that's success, but that's not the kind of money that we still need. I think we need to have, Africa would certainly need no less than $277 billion a year to be able to fulfill all the things that it committed to do in its independent, nationally determined contributions to a Paris Agreement. So there's quite a lot of ways to still go. But I don't think we will get there unless we increase concessional financing. We also have a lot more money in terms of global finance institution, climate finance institution, and making sure those institutions actually work for the countries. In other words, the least developed and most vulnerable countries. It's not just about adapting in the world of inequality of access to resources. It's moving those resources to the least developed countries that are most vulnerable to climate change, because they didn't cause it.